Hi, this is Professor Beck. Welcome to the Week 3 CIS 117 Hangout and Lecture. Since I am the only one here, I'm gathering that noontime on a Friday is a poor choice of time for hosting a Hangout. If anybody drops in during the recording, we'll greet them and incorporate them into our lecture. This session, since I'm all alone, what I plan to do is go through the parallel exercises for the assignments. I model the assignment exercises on the same concepts that are being studied each week, and so it's really easy for me to parallel the exercises from the book, the TAL distributors and the colonial exercises with the homework assignments. And so I will work through the parallel assignment from the book and also offer my comments and annotations and explanations by way of sort of a mini lecture on the techniques that we work there. And then you should be able to find the corresponding exercise in the homework assignment and knock that out. And hopefully that's a good process. I'm glad to have my face on camera today. I know that a lot of times in an online class, students expect that your instructor really looks rather alien, something like this. Hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll be thinking of me more as something like this. That's my true inner poodle. So there you are. All right, so let's get this out of the way. And then if we take a look at our homework assignment and the TAL distributors, I've got a little Word document here that parallels the two. So our first assignment here says, using the 117 database, show how many customers reside in California. That parallels very nicely the TAL distributors number 14 exercise. How many customers have balances that are more than their credit limits? So let's go ahead and open up a database. I've already connected to the TAL distributors, and of course I can get that from my course shell. There's the build script for TAL, and so I've run that build script to create the TAL database. And let's start by just selecting all the customers. And so if we run that, we get all the customers, and we can kind of gauge what are the fields in the customers table. And then what we're asked to do is to come up with a count of the customers that are over their credit limit. So let's start with just showing all the customers that are over their credit limit. So we're going to be using the balance and the credit limit fields. So let's select all customers and add a where clause. And we want everywhere that the balance, and we're using tab to autocomplete using the IntelliSense in SQL Server Management Studio. So I just typed BAL and then tab, and it completed it for me, which is really nice. So we want where the balance is greater than the customer's credit limit. Okay, and let's run that. Okay, so that shows me that there's one customer, and it tells me who he is. But what we're really interested in here is the count, and we can use the count keyword, and we can count on a certain field, which would only give us those in the result set where that field was not null. Or I can say, in this case, give me all records. So count of all records from customer that match this. And since we can see that there's only one on the screen, we would expect that this would return the number 1. And indeed it does. Very nice. Okay. Our next question, so it's going to be TAL distributor 16 is going to parallel homework question 2. In TAL, it says, list the item number, description, and on-hand value for each item whose number of units on hand is more than the average number of units on hand for all items. Okay, and there's a hint there. It says use a subquery. All right, so we're comparing the results of one query with something we already have to have computed. So we'll use one query, which will be the subquery, to compute the number of, or the average on hand on items, and then we will use that as our criteria for the outer query. So let's go ahead and see how we'll attack that. It'll be clearer when we actually do it. Okay, so let's start. We're working with the item table. Let's just do a select star from item. And I can see now the fields that I'm dealing with there. And what we would like to do is we would like to get the average of on hand. So let's just start by select on hand from item. Okay, so there's the on hand column. And what we'd like is we'd like to have just the average of that field. Okay, so the average of on-hand items is 41.53 repeating. Let's comment that out and set that aside for a moment. So we've got the first piece in our pocket. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is look at the problem. And what the problem is asking us for is it wants us to select the item number the description, and on hand from item, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we'd like to get that where clause in there, and we want the where clause to say where on hand is greater than, and we know from having run the query previously, the number is going to be 41 and a fraction. Let's just see what it looks like if we hard code it. Okay, so we see that this single query is working, but what we really want to do is tie these two together so that even if that average changes over time, this query will always be right. And let's just go ahead and wrap that whole select query. So this whole thing in between the parentheses becomes the expression that's going to return 41 or whatever the average actually is over time. And let's go ahead and run that. And we got the same result back, which since I'd hard coded it, makes sense. So that appears to be working correctly. So there we are. There's the item number, description, and on hand fields from item, where the on hand value is more than the average. So these are the things that you would say would be like a little bit overstock if you target a certain average. So might want to have a sale on these items, get rid of some of the overstock that you have. All right, moving on. Exercise number 3 is going to be parallel to TAL 18. And TAL 18 says, what is the item number, description, and price of the least expensive item in the database? Okay, so again, I'm comparing the result of one query with another query. So I'm going to use a subquery to wrap that up. And let's start with the subquery piece, which is the least expensive item in the database. How do we find the least expensive item in the database? And so that's going to be a minimum. And so I can use minimum, maximum, average functions in the query. So let's see how we do that with min. technical difficulties. Bear with me just a moment. There we go. Okay, so that's the lowest price for an item in TAL. And again, let's set that aside for a moment. And now let's take a look at what are the fields that we wanted. Let's refresh our memory here. Item number, description, price. Okay. So let's select the item number, description, price from item. That's working. And then let's add in the where clause, where price is equal to, and the minimum we know from our foreknowledge of the answer at the current time in the database is 1095. Okay, so that's working, but again, that minimum might change over time, so we want to combine these two so this query will always be right without having to update the code or without having to have special knowledge of the values in the database. So let's make that equal to, and let's turn this into a subquery by wrapping it up in parentheses. And there it is. And now if that minimum changes, that query will still remain correct. Moving on. Okay, so we've done the first three. Let's take a look at number 4. And number 4 in the exercises, in the assignments, parallels TAL question number 19. List the sum of the balances of all customers of each sales rep. Order and group the results by sales rep number. Okay, so I would suggest we work on the query first, and then after we have the query working, add the ordering and the grouping that's required. All right, so let's start out with select star from customer. Oh, is it customer? Yeah, there's our rep number. And we're going to want the rep number, and then we're going to be working with the balance. And we also, but just those two, those are the only two things we need, is the rep number and that. So let's go ahead and add that in instead of star. So let's narrow it down. Rep num, balance, from customer. Okay, but going back to our original question, it says list the sum of the balances of all customers. Okay, so we want to just get a total for that. So let's wrap that with the sum function on the balance. And trying to split it up this way gives us a complaint. It says custom rep number is invalid, select num because it is not contained in an aggregate function. So in order for us to get a sum, we first have to group the balance in such a way that it can calculate the sum with the rep number. If we didn't have the rep number in there, so we didn't have additional criteria, it would do it handily. Oh. But we actually do have the rep number in there, so we're going to have to group by that in order to get this to work. Okay, So let's add the group by clause. Forgot the comma. Okay, so now we've got essentially the answer we want, but we need to make sure that we're ordered by rep number. Now, as it happens, the data came out in the rep number order. We can't be guaranteed of that, depending on how fragmented the table is. That was probably entered in the table in this order, but that will change over time. So don't relax and assume that because it happened to come out that way that we can neglect that. We need to specifically say order by rep num. And there we go. Okay. We could also, just to show that that makes a difference, we could order that descending and change the order. But in this case, ascending. And we can explicitly put in ascending or descending. The default, if you leave it silent, is ascending. Okay. And again, just to show that what the group by function does, if we weren't taking the sum, we could still group by. Let's see what happens when we do that. What have I got in there? Not contained in the aggregate. Oh. Yeah, let's take out balance entirely. And we can still get the report grouped that way. If the rule is, if we have a field listed here, it has to appear in the aggregation as well. Okay, good to remember. All right, next exercise. Tal distributors 20 is a parallel to assignment exercise number 5. And Tal 20 says, list the sum of the balances of all customers, the sum of the balances of all customers for each sales rep. And then once we have that, we're going to add another filter on it, but restrict the output to those sales reps for which the sum is more than $5,000. So let's start by getting them all, and then we can add the restriction here in a minute. So let's say this is what we do second. This is what we do first. And then finally, order the results by sales rep number. And we'll do that third. So we now see red light, green light. What we start with the green, work to the yellow, and then finish up the red. And it's kind of nice that it's been stated that way. Makes it nice and easy. A lot of times we'd have to pull that out of the specifications and kind of put it in the order ourselves. All right, so let's take a look at Tal 20, and let's start by list the sum of the balances of all customers for each sales rep. Okay, so let's select rep num, the sum of the balance. So this looks very much like the query we just had. We could even start with that. From customer. And remember that we're going to have the group by for that aggregate function to work, for the sum to work. Group by rep num, and then let's try that much. Okay, so we've got so far the rep num and the sum of the balance, and it says no column name because we didn't give it a moniker. We could certainly do that if you wanted to rename it back to balance or sum of balance. We could say as sum of balance. That wasn't required. This is just for clarity and to show that we can do it. And so now it says sum of balance. And now we have to go back and add the other criteria. So what else did we have required there? We need to restrict the output to those sales rep for which the sum is more than 5,000. Okay, so we've got this one is going to drop out for sales rep 30 when we put in the that further restriction. Okay, and so this is an aggregate function that we want to restrict. So instead of a where clause, we're going to use the having clause to restrict it. Having sum of balance is greater than 5,000. And that one sales rep 30 dropped out. And now the last thing we need to do is make sure that it's in order. And again, it happens to be in order, but we can't trust that because this is just whatever the natural order is in the table, the order it was entered in that table, and that's going to change over time as representatives are removed from the table, and as new representatives are added, they'll get out of order. So if we want it in order, we have to specify it. Order by rep num, and it shouldn't change, and it doesn't. Okay, very good. Complex query that we nibbled to death by taking it in small bites and small pieces as we went. Okay, I like that technique. Makes it a little bit easier to debug, and you also, if you get funky results, you see them really clearly before you go on. Otherwise, you can bury funky results because you're only looking at summary numbers, and it's not as intuitive if those numbers are right or wrong. So that's what I like about this particular approach. Okay. Exercise assignment number 6 is a parallel to TAL distributors 21. List the item number of any item with an unknown description. An unknown description. Well, what does that mean? That means the description is going to be missing. It's going to be null. Okay, so we're going to need to work with a comparison on nulls, and you're going to see some questions coming up in the quizzes that says, can you compare things on nulls? So this is a great time to take a note that either yes you can or no you can't. Let's see if it's possible. Okay, so we want to select item num from item. Let's start with just that much. Good. Okay. So we're getting the item num back. So far, so good. And then if we scroll down, are there any descriptions here? That's the item num. We're not showing the description. We're not actually going to output it. Let's select item number and description. And we're going to omit the ones where the descriptions are null. Interestingly, on this data set, I'm not seeing any that are matching that, which means that if I get no results, I'm doing it right. Okay, so one way we could play with that is you could go in and modify the data and make one of these null to see if you then get one result. So you can always do that to double check it. And remember, if you foul up the data and you want to go back to what it was before, just drop the tables and then reload the build script, and you'll be back to the standard data. Okay, so we don't actually need to show the description. We just want to select item number from item where the description is equal to null. And the way we do that is we say is null. And we execute that, and there are no results. Okay, well, but we saw that there were no empty descriptions, so getting no results back actually is correct. Number 23 is a parallel for exercise 7 in the assignments. And 23 says TAL distributors is considering discounting the price of all items by 10%. So we need price times 0.90, or we could say price equals, price minus 0.10 times price. I think it's probably easier to just say 0.90 times price. List the item number, description, and discounted price for all items. Use discounted price as the name for the computed column. All right, so let's start out just getting the columns that we need. Okay, so those are the columns we're going to be working with, but then we need this computed column, which is going to be 0.90 times, oops, not description, times our price, right? There we are. All right. A little ugly because it's got all the extra variables in it, but we weren't asked to make it pretty, so we'll meet the requirements. And then we're supposed to change the moniker on this computed field. And sometimes it's not required. Sometimes it can be clarifying to wrap that up in parentheses so you can see very easily which is the formula, what is the formula, and what is the moniker, the alias that we're providing for the field. And they said call it discounted price. And now it says discounted price, and I think we've met the criteria. Next exercise. Aha. We're now over into Colonial Adventure Tours parallels. So let's get that set up by saying use Colonial. And that's online. Very good to go. And let's go ahead, just so we can use this as a reference. Let's expand out our database tree and expand out so we can see all the table names. And of course, as always, you can inspect these tables, open it up, then you can see all the different columns. You can come to the table itself, do a quick select, and see what the data is that's in there. And that all looks real healthy. And so I think we're ready to go. And let's go ahead and take a look at the first exercise. Okay. First exercise, Colonial Tours 5, is what parallels the assignment 8. And it says, list the customer number, customer last name, and customer first name of each customer that lives in New Jersey, New York, or Pennsylvania. And they tell us specifically do that using the in operator. We could do it. We could have said where the customer state is New Jersey, or the customer state is New York, or the customer state is Pennsylvania, and that would be equivalent logic. But to get the points on this one, it says use the in operator. So we're going to make a list out of New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, and we'll use the in operator to see if the customer state field for a particular record happens to be in any of the elements of that list. So let's go ahead and start by just getting our customer number, customer last name, and customer first name. Well, let's add the state temporarily so we can see that we're on the right track with our query. Okay, so if I come take a look at my customer columns here, I can see State is called state. So that's the piece that I needed to know. So parallel 5. And temporarily, let's throw in the state. Okay, so I can see what the data looks like. And now let's drop out the state. And we need to find somebody who's in New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania. So let's add the where clause. And how do we compose our ordered list? So remember to put those in quotes. Those are strings, single quotes. New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. And there it is. Now, if we wanted to make sure, do a sanity check on that, we could temporarily add back the state field and check, aha, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So that does appear to be working correctly. So we can toggle that state back out of there. And we're in good shape. And again, this is a real, anytime you have 3 or more things to compare on, it's easier to use the in than to use the or. Let's see what it would look like with the equivalent with an or clause. So here's the first condition, or state equals, and second condition, see how much extra typing we're having to do? And more typing means more opportunity to get it wrong. Like I just did. Okay, there we go. And let's just comment that part out. And so this, why does it not like Pennsylvania? Oh, because I didn't use the whole expression. You have to reiterate the entire comparison. It doesn't implicitly do comparison. It doesn't remember we're comparing on state. So state equals New Jersey, or state equals New York, or state equals Pennsylvania. And if we run that, we should see no change in the result there. Watch it and we'll see, and no change. So that's the equivalent. But again, to get the points for this exercise, it said specifically use the in clause. And so that's the cash in the bank answer there. All right, let's take a look at number 7. Number 7 in Colonial is parallel to our number 9 exercise in the assignment. How many trips are in the states of, how many trips are in the states of Maine or Massachusetts? Oh yeah, this is a tour company, so they want to know of the trips that are offered by this tour company, how many of those occur within the states of Maine or Massachusetts? So that's going to require a little bit of thinking about and analyzing of the database. We're going to have to learn this particular database model. Well, let's go take a look and see if we can figure out where we would find trips here. So if we take a look at customer, I'm not seeing anything in customer having to do with trips. Guide, reservation, trip, trip guides. Ah, trip. Let's take a look at those column. Okay, trip ID and trip name. And there's a trip state. So that probably is what we want, is the trip table. So let's take a look just to see the data on that. Let's go select star from trip. And the reason I break that out on the from clause is when queries get larger, it's just convenient to have them broken out that way rather than have a long, wide query. The computer doesn't care. I could have left it all in the same line. Okay, so I see, there's the trip name. It has a start location, a state, a distance, maximum group size that we can take on the trip. Is it hiking, paddling, by, I don't know, hang glider, and the season in which the trip is offered. Okay, so now I understand the trips database a little bit more, and I need to find the information on the trip, which was how many customers, no, modified one, how many trips are in the state of Maine or Massachusetts? So trips in Maine or Massachusetts. Okay, so by state. So let's select star from trip, where state in Maine or Massachusetts. Okay, this will tell me not how many, this will tell me, what are they? Okay, so there's the trips that are in Maine or Massachusetts. And if I scroll down to the bottom, I can see that there are 16 rows returned. But in order to get the query to do that for me automatically, we need to do that count function again. And we can see by the detail that we ought to have 16 rows returned. Let's see if that is the case. Ha! Love it. All right, moving on. Number 8 is parallel to our assignment number 10. So 8 in Colonial is a good parallel for that. How many trips originates in each state? So I'm going to have to basically group things into states and then count how many for each of those groups, right? So I can tell that this is going to be some aggregation, some grouping that needs to be done. Okay, so let's see how we can whittle away at this one. Okay, so I'm still working in the trip database, and I'm going to need the state, and I'm going to need the trip ID, and let's see how far that gets me. Okay, so I can see the states and the individual trip IDs. Okay, now I need to group these. Now if I group them by state and that's all I've got, is this going to work? Is trip ID part of the aggregate? No, it's not. So I have to have that as part of the expression, or I have to be doing something else with it. Okay, so what I really want is not the trip ID, but I want to know how many there are. And now instead of counting star, I'm counting the instances of that field. Okay, so now I have the state and how many trips in each state. That's basically the requirement that we were after, but wasn't there a requirement to have them in order? And again, as it happens, looks to me like the original table was created with the states being entered in order, but you can't count on that. So we need to make sure that that order by clause is in there explicitly. And there's our answer. So 2 in Connecticut, 4 in Massachusetts, 12 in Maine, 19 in New Hampshire, and 4 in Vermont. Number 9 parallels exercise number 11. So number 9 on Colonial. How many reservations include a trip price that is greater than 20 but less than 75? Okay. Now, you might be tempted to use the between, and that would be fine if it was greater than or equal to 20 and less than or equal to 75, but that's not going to work here. We could probably play, if we wanted to use between, we could, if we were careful about our units, we could say between you know, 20.01, $20 and a penny, and $74.99. So shave a penny off either side, but be careful. You need to make sure that we're cutting a penny off because that's the smallest unit. In some cases, you really need to be absolute in it. Penny either way or the smallest unit either way may be too much variance. So this is one area where between is probably not what we want to use to answer this. So we're going to use a conjunction. It's this and that, and we'll use comparison. Greater than this and less than that. And does that make sense? Can something be greater than 20 at the same time that it is less than 75? Yes, it can. So that makes logical sense. So let's take a look at how we would do that. So we want to select trip IDs from trip, and we want to group them by state. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong problem. Okay, so we want to select the trip price, and that we're not going to find in the trip table. So let's go ahead and find the trip price, maybe in reservation, trip ID, trip date, trip price. Okay, so we're going to do this using the reservation table. Let's start with that. Okay, there's our trip price from the reservation table. And we want the results only where trip price is greater than 20 and trip price is less than 75. And again, for my eyes, this is often confusing to read. They're not required, but I like to put in the parentheses because I can then see how the terms are being compared, and it's much clearer. Personal preference, it's not required. The solution that without that would still be correct. So let's see what we've got now. Okay, so these are the trip prices that are between greater than 20 bucks and less than 75 bucks. But that's not enough because what we were asked to do was ask how many. And if we look at the detail, we can see that there are 13 rows. So if we come back with the count of the trip price, we should end up with 13. Let's see if that's the case. It is indeed. Love it. Alrighty. Our next colonial exercise number 10 is parallel to what you will need to do the assignment number 12. How many trips? So anytime we see a how many, we're almost always going to use a count function. How many trips of each type are there? Okay, so when we say count and of each, we're going to use count, and we're almost certain to be using a group by because we want to know of each group or each type. So we're going to be doing some grouping. So let's see about that. So we want trip ID is what we're counting. We're going to be counting. And we also need, before that, we need to know of each type. So we need type and we need trip ID. From trip, and let's take a look at that. And again, checking along the way kind of helps us to do a sanity check. So that looks good. And we're not going to want just trip, we're going to want the count of trip. And complaining that we're using an aggregate without aggregating, so we need to add in our group by. And there's basically our answer. And we got biking, hiking, and paddling. And again, we're fortunate enough that these are falling out in a happy order, probably because of the way the data set was created. Over time, we're going to add rows, we're going to delete rows as records come and go interchange, so we can't count on that to always give it to us in order. So let's add the order by type. And there we are. Moving on, we're closing in on it now, just a couple more to go. Okay, so Colonial Adventures number 11 is parallel for our assignment exercise number 13. So whatever you learn in this is going to be useful to solving exercise 13 in the homework. And this one looks a little larger and more threatening. Let's read through it. Colonial Adventure Tours calculates the total price of a trip. So I'm going to have a sum, right? Because I got a total price of a trip by adding the trip price plus other fees. So there's going to be some formula, and multiplying the result by the number of persons included in the reservation. Holy smokes. Okay. Then it wants us to list the reservation ID, trip ID, customer number, and total price for all reservations. Where the number of persons is greater than 4, use the column name total price for the calculated field. Okay, this is where chopping it into little pieces to make it an easier problem really pays off, because there is a lot going on in number 11. Okay, so let's try working on it. Start with the basic. We're working on the reservation table. There's the whole table. Okay. Now, from that, we want to display the reservation ID, the trip ID, the customer number, and then there's going to be something we're going to do with the trip price, and there's something we're going to do with other fees, and there's something we're going to do with the number of persons. Let's see if this much is working. Okay, that much is working. Okay, and you could do this now or you could do it later, your choice. We also have a limitation that we're only interested in doing whatever this thing is that we're going to do where the number of persons is greater than 4. Okay, so ultimately we're going to do this for these 4 rows. Now what we're going to do, if we read it over again, is that we want not these individual costs and fees. We want to add them together, trip price plus other fees times the number of persons. Okay, so basically we're going to take trip price and we're going to be adding it to other fees. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, we haven't named the column, but there's the total of trip price and other fees, and then there's the number of persons. Now what we want to do then is multiply that by the number of persons. Okay, so now we have the answer, but we haven't labeled the column the way they want it labeled. So let's take this whole thing, and again, personal choice. I like to take the whole expression and wrap it up in parentheses just for clarity of reading as total price. Very good. And they did not have us add an order clause to that. So we're good. Had they wanted ordered, so for instance, if we wanted it ordered by trip ID, we finally have an example that would have been useful. It didn't happen to come out in the natural order by trip ID, but had we wanted it that way, we could certainly have done it by simply saying order by trip ID. And now it's a much more nicely formatted report, nicely ordered. Okay, but again, that wasn't required. Don't elaborate, just do the basic that you need to get the points. Otherwise, you're going to confuse me when I'm grading, and that would be ugly. All right. You tired? I'm tired. Hang in there, just 2 more. Okay. So, assignment exercise 14, parallels colonial distributors. Number 14. What is the average distance and the average maximum group size? So every trip has a maximum group size. On average, what is the most number of people that can be accommodated in the trip is what they're asking. Okay, for each trip. Sounds like we're going to be back in the trips database on number 14 and or the trips table. So select star from trip. Can we do it with the data that's in trip? Yep, looks like we can. Okay. And so what we want to do is we want to select, we're going to be dealing with 2 fields here that we're going to calculate on. Distance and max group size. Okay, there they are. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take, one of them is going to be the average of distance, the other is going to be the maximum of group size. We've tried that a couple times. We know that if I do that without having built the grouping by, trying the aggregation, without the aggregation clause in there, it's going to fail. So let's go ahead and put the aggregation in first. And what are we grouping by? We're grouping by the type of the trip. Distance is invalid because it's not in the aggregate function, but we don't want distance. What would be aggregated would be the average. We could do the sum, we could do the minimum, we could do the maximum. Will this work? Nope, same problem, only now on max group size. Okay, so just to emphasize, we have to have the expressions in the aggregate function or it's going to throw an error. There's an aggregate function, take the average and group by type, and now it's happy. And oh, we left one other thing out. Wanted to show the type. Biking, hiking, and paddling. And again, that happily falls out in the right order, but just to make sure, in case our data were to change, Run it again. And interesting, they didn't have us say what the column names were for the average of distance, and we can do that. And now it's a little prettier. Alrighty, ready to wrap this one up? Number 15 in the assignments is parallel to number 16 in the Colonial Adventure Tours. List the reservation IDs for reservations. Okay, so we're working with the reservation table that are for a paddling trip. Reservations IDs just for a paddling trip, and the hint is use a subquery. Actually, let's start with the inner part. There's our trip IDs. What trip IDs do I want? I don't want all the trip IDs. I only want the trip IDs where the type of the trip is paddling. And watch the upper and lower case here. I'll show you why. Oh, don't need that yet. Okay. The reason you have to watch the upper and lower case is if I type this all uppercase or all lowercase, what is the result? Oh, not case sensitive. Okay. That's a setting on the database. Forgotten SQL Server is case insensitive by default. A lot of databases are not, and that's worth mentioning now. So make sure that you are careful in using the upper and lower case. Okay, so we want the trip where type equals paddling. So there's all of our paddling trips. And that's going to be our filter. So let's take this and again, put that aside for a moment. And I see the trip IDs, let's just grab a couple of those, 7, 11, 19. So 7, 11, that's easy to remember. We'll use those for our test momentarily. And then I can come up here and hit the comment out selected lines. So I don't have to type all the comment marks in there. And now let's work on the outside of that query. So the outside, what we wanted was, we want the reservation ID from reservation where trip ID is in, and we said a couple of those were 7 and 11, right? Okay, so there's one that was in 7 or 11, but 7 and 11 is not the whole list. The whole list actually comes from this query down here. So let's go ahead and combine those two queries where it is in. And if I highlight this and then use the uncomment, it takes all the comments off. And now remember to make it a subquery, wrap it in a parenthetical hug, feel the love. And there we are. So there's the reservation IDs currently made for paddling trips. And with that, I think we've knocked out parallels for each of the 15 exercises. If you have problems or questions, hit me up in the Ask the Professor discussion, or email me, or give me a telephone call at the number listed in the syllabus. Thanks for watching.